I still remember the moment my marriage officially flatlined. It wasn't in a heated argument or after a terrible fight. It was while I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked to an IV, when a courier delivered divorce papers with my husband Blake's signature already dried on the dotted line. What Blake couldn't have known then was that the name of my attorney would soon make him regret his calculated cruelty. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room had become almost comforting after 3 weeks of recovery. The rhythmic beeping of monitors had become my constant companion, marking time in a way that felt both endless and suspended. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'd been admitted for emergency surgery after what doctors initially thought was appendicitis turned out to be a ruptured ovarian cyst with complications. The infection had spread, requiring multiple surgeries and a longer recovery than anyone had anticipated. Blake had visited twice in the first week. Brief, awkward appearances where he stood near the door rather than beside my bed. His attention constantly pulled to his phone. By the second week, the visit stopped entirely. "Work is crazy," his text explained. "The Jensen account is consuming all my time." I'd believed him because I'd always believed him. That Wednesday afternoon, I was finally feeling stronger. The doctors were pleased with my progress, discussing discharge plans for the following week. I'd just finished a call with my colleague Carrie, who had been keeping my consulting business afloat during my absence, when there was a knock at the door. The courier was young, probably a college student making extra money. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to another as he asked me to confirm my identity. "Delivery for Elodie Winters," he said, extending a thick manila envelope. I remember the weight of it in my hands. How official it felt. How final. I didn't open it immediately. Something in me already knew what it contained, as if my body was preparing for the blow before my mind had processed it. When I finally slid my finger under the seal and pulled out the documents, the words, "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage," seemed to float off the page, hovering in the sterile hospital air like a cruel joke. Blake hadn't even waited for me to recover. Hadn't given me the courtesy of a conversation. Just clinical, legal papers while I was literally at my weakest. The irony wasn't lost on me. My body was finally healing while my marriage was being officially declared terminal. I scanned the documents, noting how thorough Blake had been. He'd listed all our assets, already proposing a division that heavily favored him. Our house, the Victorian I'd spent 2 years renovating, he wanted to sell and split the proceeds, despite the fact that I'd owned it before our marriage. My consulting business, which I'd built from nothing to a 7-figure enterprise, he was claiming partial ownership of because he'd contributed strategic advice. Even my grandmother's antique jewelry collection was listed as joint property, to be appraised and divided. There was a sticky note attached to the last page, placed there by his lawyer. "Mr. Winters requests an expedited process. Please sign and return at your earliest convenience." At your earliest convenience. As if I were simply being asked to approve a meeting agenda rather than dismantle the past 7 years of my life. The monitors beside my bed registered a spike in my heart rate. A nurse poked her head in, concern creasing her brow. "Everything okay, Mrs. Winters?" Mrs. Winters, soon to be Ms. Harrington again. The thought was oddly clarifying. "Just some unexpected paperwork," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Could you ask Dr. Perry to stop by when he has a moment? I need to discuss my discharge options." The nurse nodded, glancing curiously at the papers in my lap before withdrawing. Alone again, I forced myself to read every word of Blake's petition. The legal language was dense, designed to obscure rather than clarify. But beneath the therefores and wherefores was a simple truth. While I had been fighting for my health, my husband had been strategizing my exit from his life. I reached for my phone, my first instinct to call him, to demand an explanation. but as my finger hovered over his name, a strange calm descended over me. What would a confrontation achieve? Tears? Accusations? A pitiful plea for reconsideration? None of those would serve me now. Instead, I set down the papers and took a deep breath, feeling the pull of stitches across my abdomen, a physical reminder of how vulnerable I still was. But vulnerable didn't mean defenseless. I scrolled past Blake's name in my contacts and stopped at another. Dominique St. Clair. Dominique and I had been roommates in law school before I'd switched to business. She had gone on to become one of the most feared divorce attorneys in the state, a fact that Blake, who had met her only twice at dinner parties where she'd been perfectly charming, was likely unaware of. But I knew Dominique's reputation. I'd heard the stories, how she could dismantle the most carefully constructed prenups, how she seemed to uncover hidden assets like she had a financial sixth sense, how opposing counsel visibly deflated when they saw her name on the docket. Edgar, Green and St. Clair, how may I direct your call? The receptionist's voice was crisp, professional. Dominique St. Clair, please. Tell her it's Elodie Harrington. There was a pause, some clicking, then, please hold. Please. 30 seconds later, Dominique's familiar voice filled the line. Elodie, I heard you were in the hospital. Are you okay? Not exactly, I said, glancing down at the divorce petition. I need your help, Dom. Blake just had divorce papers delivered to my hospital room. There was a moment of silence, then a low whistle. Wow. That's cold, even for the cases I usually see. It gets better, I continued, flipping through the documents. He's trying to claim part of my business, the house, even my grandmother's jewelry. Tell me you had a prenup. Dominique's voice had shifted from friend to attorney in an instant. We did, but it was his lawyer who drafted it. Connor Mills. Mills? Now there was a smile in Dominique's voice. Oh, honey, I eat Connor Mills for breakfast. He's all bluster and no substance. Always leaves gaps you could drive a truck through. I felt something then. Not quite hope, but its more sustainable cousin. Determination. I'm still in the hospital, I said. But I should be discharged next week. Can we meet then? No, Dominique replied firmly. We meet now. I'm coming to you. Hospital rooms have terrible acoustics, but excellent witness potential if we need to document the timing of his service while you're still admitted. Don't sign anything. Don't call Blake. Don't do anything until I get there. As I ended the call, I stared again at the divorce papers. The initial shock was fading, replaced by something colder and more focused. Blake had always underestimated me, in business, in our social circle, and now, apparently, in divorce. He thought me weakened, an easy target in my hospital bed. What he didn't know was that he'd just made the first move in a game I had no intention of losing. The hospital? Room felt different after Dominique left. Her brief but potent visit had transformed the sterile space from a place of vulnerability to one of strategy. She had sat perched on the edge of my bed, her designer suit incongruous against the clinical white sheets, reviewing Blake's petition with increasingly raised eyebrows. This is ambitious, even for Connor Mills, she'd said, tapping a manicured nail against a particularly audacious claim to my business assets. But ambition isn't the same as legal standing. Now, alone with my thoughts, I felt the full weight of Blake's betrayal settle over me. 7 years of marriage, dissolved in the most callous way possible. I thought about the nights I'd stayed up waiting for him to come home, the business trips that grew increasingly frequent, the way he'd distanced himself even before my health crisis. The signs had been there, but I'd chosen not to read them. The rational part of my brain understood that I should be devastated, that I should be crying or raging or calling my friends for support. Instead, I felt an odd, detached clarity. The monitor beside me showed my heart rate, steady even. The nurse had commented on it earlier, surprised by my composure given what she'd deduced about the delivery. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You must be in shock, she'd said kindly, adjusting my IV. But I wasn't in shock. I was in assessment mode, the same state of mind that had helped me build my consulting firm from nothing to a multi-million-dollar business. When faced with a crisis, I didn't panic. I planned. I reached for my phone and opened my banking app. As expected, our joint account had been drained except for a token $500, exactly the minimum required to keep the account open. Blake had moved quickly, but not completely. That told me something important. He was being advised to appear reasonable, while actually leaving me financially vulnerable. Next, I checked my business accounts. They were untouched, still under my sole control. Blake had been listed as an authorized user on one credit card for business expenses, which I immediately deactivated. A small move, but a necessary one. I considered calling him. The temptation to demand answers burned in my throat. Why now? Why like this? But Dominique's advice echoed in my mind. Don't give him anything. Not your anger, not your hurt, not one single reaction he can use. Radio silence is your best strategy right now. So instead of calling Blake, I called Carrie, my business partner. How are you feeling? She asked immediately. Need me to sneak in some real food? That hospital stuff is basically colored cardboard. I need you to do something more important, I said, keeping my voice even. Blake and I are getting divorced. He's trying to claim partial ownership of the firm. He's what? Carrie's indignation burst through the phone. On what grounds? He's never even worked there. He's claiming his strategic advice was instrumental to our growth. I need you to go to the office and secure all our documents, contracts, client agreements, especially anything from the founding of the company. I want digital copies sent to my personal email, not my work account. And Carrie? Don't tell anyone yet, not even Miranda. Miranda was our office manager and Carrie's girlfriend. She was also friendly with Blake, often joining him for lunch when he visited the office. You think she'd say something? Carrie asked, her voice lowered. I don't know, I admitted. But right now, I can't risk it. Information control is critical. After ending the call, I turned my attention to personal matters. I opened my laptop, grateful that I'd insisted on bringing it to the hospital, and began documenting everything I could remember about our finances, properties, and valuable possessions. Each item went into a spreadsheet with notes about when it was acquired, by whom, and with what money. The exercise was oddly calming. Each entry was a piece of my life being recategorized, reassessed. This watch, pre-marriage, that painting, purchased with my bonus, though Blake had selected it. Our vacation home in the mountains, down payment from my inheritance, mortgage payments from joint funds. As I worked, a message appeared on my phone. Blake, I assume you received the papers. I didn't want it to happen this way. Call me when you're ready to discuss. The calculated casualness of it made something harden inside me. He didn't want it to happen this way, yet he had made the deliberate choice to serve me divorce papers in a hospital bed. He wanted to discuss, after presenting me with a completed petition rather than a conversation. I didn't respond. Instead, I returned to my spreadsheet, adding entries with meticulous precision. By the time the night nurse came in for my evening, I had compiled a comprehensive inventory of our married life, categorized by legal ownership potential. You should rest, she advised, noting my activity. Whatever it is can wait until you're stronger. I smiled at her concern. Actually, this is helping me get stronger. She didn't understand, but she didn't need to. In the face of Blake's calculated attack, my spreadsheets and documentation were my armor, my preparation for the battle ahead. That night, for the first time since my surgery, I slept soundly. No anxiety dreams, no waking in pain, just deep, restorative rest. While my body continued its physical healing, my mind had found its footing. Blake had thought to catch me at my weakest, but he had miscalculated severely. My phone chimed again at 6 a.m. Another message from Blake, this one less composed. "Elodie, please call me. We need to talk before things progress further." Again, I didn't respond. Let him wonder. Let him worry. The ball was in my court now, and I intended to take my time deciding how to play it. When Dr. Perry made his morning rounds, he was pleased with my recovery progress. "You look better today," he observed, reviewing my chart. "Your numbers are all trending in the right direction." "I feel stronger," I told him, and it wasn't just physical. Something fundamental had shifted inside me, a realignment of purpose and focus. Blake had thought to dismantle our marriage while I was literally stitched together. Instead, he had inadvertently triggered a rebuilding, not of us, but of me. Few people knew the real Elodie Harrington beneath the polished exterior I presented to the world. Blake certainly didn't, not anymore. Somewhere between our vows and his betrayal, he had stopped seeing me, really seeing me, and had instead created a convenient fiction. Elodie, the amenable wife who could be dismissed and discarded when no longer useful. What Blake had forgotten, or perhaps never fully appreciated, was my history before him. I hadn't always been Elodie Winters, successful consultant and devoted wife. Long before I met Blake, I had been Elodie Harrington, the girl who put herself through college after her parents' devastating financial collapse, who worked 3 jobs, while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, who had built something from nothing more than once in her life. Resilience wasn't just a quality I possessed, it was the foundation of who I was. Dr. Perry had approved my request for an early discharge, with conditions. "You'll need home care for at least 2 weeks, he explained, reviewing my chart. "Someone to help with meals, medication management, and to monitor for any signs of renewed infection." In my previous life, my life with Blake, this wouldn't have been a concern. Now it presented a logistical challenge. I couldn't return to our house. Not only would it mean facing Blake, but it would put me at a strategic disadvantage, making me appear dependent on the very person trying to take everything from me. "I've already arranged for private nursing care," I told Dr. Perry, though I hadn't until that moment. "I'll be staying with a friend." The friend was Lorna, my former assistant who had gone on to start her own event planning business. We had stayed close over the years, despite Blake's thinly veiled disdain for her bohemian lifestyle and outspoken personality. Most importantly, Lorna lived in a garden apartment with a separate entrance and no stairs, perfect for someone recovering from abdominal surgery. When I called to ask, Lorna didn't hesitate. "I'll make up the guest room right now," she said. "And Elodie? Blake is a fool." That simple declaration of loyalty meant more than she knew. My phone had been relatively quiet since my decision not to respond to Blake's messages. Then, on the morning of my discharge, everything changed. 3 messages in quick succession. "Elodie, Connor just received notice that you've retained counsel." "Dominique St. Clair? Seriously? This doesn't have to be contentious. Please call me. This is getting out of hand?" I allowed myself a small smile as I packed my few belongings. Dominique had made her first move, a simple notice of representation, and Blake was already rattled. Good. The hospital discharge process was mercifully efficient. A nurse named Gary helped me into a wheelchair, standard protocol, though I felt steady enough to walk, and rolled me to the entrance where Lorna waited with her vintage Mercedes, the back seat arranged with pillows to make the ride comfortable. "Your chariot awaits, warrior princess," she said with a grin, helping me from the wheelchair into the car. As Gary returned to the hospital, Lorna leaned in close. "There's someone watching from a car across the street. Dark blue BMW. Isn't that Blake's car?" I confirmed, not bothering to look. "He's too much of a coward to approach directly. but too controlling not to monitor my movements. Want me to flip him off? I've been practicing my one-handed driving specifically for moments like this. I laughed. A genuine laugh. My first in weeks. No, but thank you for the offer. Let him watch. Let him wonder. The ride to Lorna's apartment was a revelation of spring in full bloom. After weeks in the hospital, the vibrant colors of flowers and trees heavy with leaves seemed almost surreal in their beauty. I had missed the transition from late winter to mid-spring, another loss to add to the tally. You've got that look? Lorna observed, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. What look? The one you get when you're mentally rearranging puzzle pieces. I've seen it before, right before you restructured your entire business model because you foresaw the market shift. Nobody else did. I hadn't realized my strategic thinking had such a visible tell. I'm just processing, I said. Process away, she replied, turning onto her tree-lined street. Just remember to let yourself feel things too. Strategy is important, but so is acknowledging pain. Lorna's advice was well-intentioned, but acknowledging pain would have to wait. Right now, I needed to stay focused, clear-headed, and 10 steps ahead of Blake and his attorney. The garden apartment was exactly what I needed. Peaceful, private, and far from the modern glass mansion Blake and I had called home for the past 3 years. Lorna had transformed the guest room into a recovery sanctuary, complete with extra pillows, a small refrigerator stocked with healthy snacks, and a vase of fresh peonies, my favorite. The home health nurse will be here at 4, she said, helping me settle onto the comfortable daybed positioned to look out over her lush garden. And Dominique called. She's stopping by tomorrow morning. Said to tell you, and I quote, "It's already working." I nodded, understanding the cryptic message. Blake's panicked texts were evidence of Dominique's assessment. He had expected me to be emotional, disorganized, and willing to accept his terms out of desperation or a desire to avoid conflict. My silence, coupled with retaining one of the city's most formidable divorce attorneys, had disrupted his narrative. As Lorna busied herself arranging my medications and setting up a small workspace, I opened my laptop and checked my email. Carrie had come through magnificently. The secure folder contained scans of all our founding documents, client contracts, and most importantly, clear evidence that Blake's strategic contributions to my business had been minimal and largely ignored. There was also an email from our family attorney, not Connor Mills, but Stan Geller, who had handled our estate planning and other non-contentious matters. The message was brief. Elodie, Blake has asked me to reach out regarding a possible amicable resolution. Please call at your convenience. Stan was a decent man, but he was also Blake's golf buddy. His involvement suggested Blake was getting nervous about the direction things were heading. He was looking for back channels, trying to avoid dealing directly with Dominique. I closed my laptop without responding. Let Blake sweat. Let him wonder if his comfortable world was about to be upended the way he had upended mine. The home health nurse, a no-nonsense woman named Stella, arrived precisely at 4. She checked my incisions, reviewed my medication schedule, and seemed satisfied with my recovery progress. You're healing well physically, she observed as she packed up her supplies. But remember that stress can impede recovery. Whatever's going on in your life, and I'm not prying, try to keep your stress levels manageable. I nodded, not bothering to explain that the very thing causing my stress was also fueling my recovery. Every message from Blake, every indication that he was worried about my next move, was like a tonic, strengthening my resolve and clarifying my purpose. That evening, as Lorna and I shared a simple dinner of homemade soup and fresh bread, my phone lit up with another message from Blake. Elodie, please. I don't want this to get ugly. Call me. We can work this out. I showed the message to Lorna, who rolled her eyes dramatically. Translation. I'm terrified of what Dominique might uncover. So let's settle this before she starts digging. Exactly. I agreed. And that tells me there's something to find. The pale morning light filtered through the gauzy curtains of Lorna's guest room as I sipped my tea, reviewing my notes before Dominique's arrival. Sleep had been elusive, not from physical pain, but from the mental exercise of connecting dots. That had been there all along, dots I had deliberately ignored during my marriage. Blake's sudden desire for divorce hadn't materialized from thin air. Like all seismic shifts, there had been tremors leading up to it, subtle warnings I had chosen not to heed. I opened my personal journal on my laptop, the one Blake didn't know existed, and began scrolling through entries from the past year. The pattern emerged with painful clarity. January. Blake canceled our anniversary trip, claiming the Shanghai deal couldn't proceed without him. Brought me an expensive bracelet instead. Said we'd reschedule. March. Found a receipt for dinner at Maison Laurent in Blake's jacket, $347 for two. When I mentioned it, he said it was a client dinner with Gary from Apex Solutions. Something felt off about his explanation. May. Blake suggested I put the mountain cabin in his name for tax purposes. Said his financial advisor recommended it need to follow up. July. Blake unusually interested in my business's financial reports this quarter, asking specific questions about valuation methods. Says he's just proud and curious. August. Blake insisting I sell my grandmother's jewelry collection. Claims it's just sitting in a safe deposit box, and the money could be better invested. Felt like he was pushing too hard. October. Blake claimed another last-minute business trip, 3rd this month. Called the office when he didn't answer his cell. Melissa said he wasn't scheduled to be traveling for work. The entries continued, each one a red flag I had rationalized away. The most damning was from just 2 weeks before my hospitalization. Found Blake in the home office at 2 a.m., closing laptop quickly when I entered. Claimed insomnia, but I glimpsed what looked like property listings in Lake Tahoe. When I asked, he said he was just browsing, thinking about a vacation property as a surprise. For me. I closed the journal, feeling a cold clarity wash over me. Blake hadn't just decided to leave me when I became ill. He had been planning his exit for months, possibly longer. The divorce papers weren't impulsive. They were the culmination of a carefully orchestrated strategy. Even more concerning were the financial implications. His sudden interest in my business valuation, the push to transfer property, the suggestion to sell valuable assets. These weren't random requests. They were calculated moves to position himself advantageously before filing for divorce. The doorbell rang precisely at 9. Lorna showed Dominique in, then tactfully made herself scarce, mentioning errands that suddenly needed immediate attention. Dominique looked as formidable as ever in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. She set her briefcase on the coffee table and fixed me with an appraising look. "You look better than I expected," she said, taking a seat across from me. "How's the recovery?" "Progressing," I replied, "physically and strategically." She smiled at that. "Good, because we have work to do." She opened her briefcase and removed a thick folder. "I've been busy since our hospital meeting. Blake's petition is aggressive but built on shaky legal ground. Connor Mills is taking a standard ask-for-everything approach, hoping you'll be too overwhelmed to fight back effectively." "That tracks with what I've uncovered," I said, sharing my journal observations and the timeline I'd constructed. Dominique's expression darkened as she reviewed my notes. "This is methodical. Blake's been positioning for this divorce for at least a year." She tapped on the entry about the property listings. "Lake Tahoe, you said?" I nodded. "Interesting." Connor included a statement of assets that doesn't mention any property in Tahoe. She made a note in her legal pad. "First discrepancy. There will be others." "What's our next move?" I asked. "We have options. We could go aggressive immediately. File counterclaims, demand full financial discovery, depose Blake about potential hidden assets." She paused, studying me. "Or we could play a longer game. Let Blake think his strategy is working, that you're still disoriented from your medical situation while we quietly build our case. The second option, I said without hesitation. Blake expects me to either fall apart or rage against him. He's not prepared for calculated patience. Dominique nodded approvingly. My thought exactly. Also, I took the liberty of running a deep financial background check on Blake. There are some irregularities in his recent transactions. She placed several bank statements on the table. Large withdrawals over the past 6 months, wire transfers to an account in Nevada, a state known for its asset protection laws. He's hiding money, I said, the realization solid and cold in my stomach. Almost certainly. And doing it rather clumsily. Honestly, Blake may be a successful businessman, but he's an amateur at financial concealment. Dominique looked almost disappointed at the lack of challenge. We'll need a forensic accountant to trace everything, but I'd estimate he's moved at least $300,000 that should be considered marital assets. The amount should have shocked me. Instead, it was simply confirmation of what I already suspected. Blake had been planning this meticulously, moving chess pieces into position long before making his move. There's something else, Dominique continued. The timing of Blake's petition, while you were hospitalized, isn't just cruel. It's potentially strategic. Under normal circumstances, courts look unfavorably on divorces initiated while a spouse is seriously ill. It suggests abandonment and lack of good faith. So why risk it? Because he's been advised that your medical situation might make you more likely to settle quickly and unfavorably. Her expression hardened. It's a calculated risk on his part, betting that you'd be too physically and emotionally compromised to mount an effective defense. The pieces were falling into place. Blake hadn't just betrayed our marriage. He had attempted to weaponize my illness against me. The realization should have hurt. Instead, it hardened my resolve. Blake's always underestimated me, I said quietly. In business, in our marriage, and now in its dissolution. Then let's use that to our advantage. Dominique began outlining our counter-strategy. We would respond to Blake's petition with minimal pushback initially, just enough to protect my interests without revealing our full awareness of his maneuvers. Meanwhile, we would document every financial discrepancy, build a comprehensive record of his systematic preparation for divorce, and prepare to reveal it all at the most strategically advantageous moment. One more thing, Dominique said as she packed up her materials. Blake called my office 3 times yesterday. My assistant said he sounded increasingly agitated. What did he want? To discuss settling this matter expeditiously and equitably. She made air quotes around the phrase. Translation, he wants to end this before we dig too deep. And your response? That I was fully committed to an equitable resolution. Her smile was razor-sharp. Once we had completed a thorough review of all marital assets, including any that may have been inadvertently omitted from his initial disclosures. As Dominique left, promising to return in 2 days with additional documentation, I felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. The pattern of Blake's betrayal was now fully visible, like a constellation finally recognized among random stars. Knowledge was power. And for the first time since receiving those divorce papers in my hospital bed, I felt truly powerful. That evening, as Lorna prepared dinner, I sat in the garden with my laptop open and a legal pad beside me. The golden hour sunlight cast long shadows across the flagstone patio, creating a peaceful backdrop that contrasted sharply with my methodical planning. You've got that look again, Lorna observed, bringing out 2 glasses of iced tea. The Elodie, Harrington battle plan face. Is it that obvious? I asked, accepting the drink gratefully, only to someone who's known you since you were living on ramen and determination. She glanced at my notes. What's the strategy? I considered how much to share. Lorna was trustworthy, but the fewer people who knew the details of my approach, the better. Blake had friends everywhere, Connections built over years of networking and strategic socializing. I'm mapping out potential scenarios, I said finally. Blake's moves, my counter moves, the optimal sequence of actions. Lorna settled into the chair beside me. You know, most people going through divorce are barely functioning. They're angry or devastated or both. You're approaching it like a military campaign. Because that's essentially what it is, I replied. Blake declared war when he served me those papers in the hospital. He just didn't expect me to fight back effectively. My phone chimed with an incoming email. It was from Stan Geller, Blake's friend and our family attorney. Elodie, Blake has authorized me to propose an initial settlement offer. He is prepared to be generous given your health situation. Please call to discuss at your earliest convenience. I showed Lorna the email, and she snorted. Generous? That's rich. What does he consider generous? Letting you keep your toothbrush? Actually, this is good news, I said, forwarding the email to Dominique. It means he's nervous, trying to settle quickly before we uncover the full extent of what he's been doing. So what's the plan? Ignore it? I shook my head. No. We acknowledge receipt, but defer to Dominique. It gives the appearance of someone still recovering, reliant on their attorney to handle the details. I tapped out a brief response. Stan, thank you for reaching out. As you know, I'm still recovering from surgery and have retained Dominique St. Clair to handle all divorce-related matters. Please direct any settlement offers to her office. Best, Elodie professional, polite, and completely non-committal. Perfectly. Bland, Lorna approved, reading over my shoulder. You could be teaching a masterclass in strategic indifference. After sending the email, I returned to my planning. My strategy was shaping up around 3 core principles. First, information asymmetry. Blake believed he knew everything about our finances and my business, while I knew little about his recent maneuvers. I would maintain that illusion while quietly gathering intelligence. Second, patience. Blake was already showing signs of anxiety, making multiple calls to Dominique's office and now sending settlement offers through Stan. His impatience would lead to mistakes. Third, leverage. I needed something beyond financial discrepancies, something that would make Blake eager to settle on my terms rather than risk public exposure. Lorna, I said slowly, how well do you know Miranda from my office? Lorna looked surprised by the change of subject. Carrie's girlfriend? Well enough, I suppose. We've done a few happy hours together. Why? Has she ever mentioned Blake's visits to the office, particularly when I was traveling for clients? Lorna's expression shifted from confusion to realization. You think he was up to something during those visits? I think it's worth exploring, I said carefully. Blake always insisted on having access to my office, claiming he might need to retrieve documents from my desk or use the conference room for his own meetings when I was away. And you think he was doing something else? I don't know, I admitted. But it's a loose thread worth pulling. Lorna considered this. I could ask her to meet for drinks, not obviously fishing for information, just catching up. That would be helpful, I agreed. Just be subtle. The next morning, I woke to 3 missed calls from Blake and a text message. I know you're staying with Lorna. We need to talk, Elodie. This situation is spiraling, and it doesn't need to be this way. I'm willing to be fair. I showed the message to Dominique when she arrived for our scheduled meeting. How did he know you're here? She asked, frowning. He followed me from the hospital, I explained. Lorna spotted his car. That's concerning, Dominique said. Bordering on stalking behavior. Let's document it. She added it to her growing file of Blake's questionable actions, then spread several documents across the coffee table. I've been looking into those Nevada transfers, she said. They're connected to a recently formed LLC called Winterfall Holdings. Not exactly subtle, combining your last name with a reference to downfall. That sounds like Blake, I said. He always thought he was cleverer than he actually was. The good news is, it's traceable. The bad news is, there's more. She handed me a document showing a mortgage application. Blake applied for financing on a Lake Tahoe property 3 weeks ago, listed himself as separated, and only included his personal income, not marital assets. I studied the document, noting the address of the property, a lakefront home valued at $2.1 million. He's been planning this for months, I said, the evidence now undeniable. Years, possibly, Dominique corrected. Look at the date he established the Nevada LLC. It was 18 months ago, around the time Blake had begun pushing for me to expand my consulting business, taking on more clients and traveling more frequently. Had that been part of his plan too? Keep me busy and distracted while he prepared his exit strategy? There's something else, Dominique continued, her expression uncharacteristically hesitant. My investigator found some personal information that might be relevant. She placed several photographs on the table. They showed Blake entering a high-end apartment building in the downtown financial district. The timestamp showed it was from 2 months ago, while I was in Tokyo for a major client presentation. The next photo showed him leaving the following morning, clearly wearing the same clothes. The apartment belongs to someone named Carissa Powell, Dominique said gently. She's an investment banker at Merrill, 32 years old. They've been seen together at several industry events over the past year. I stared at the photos, feeling strangely detached. The betrayal should have hurt, should have made me angry. Instead, it was simply one more piece of information to process, one more factor to consider in my strategy. Can we prove a longer-term relationship? I asked, my voice steady. Dominique looked momentarily taken aback by my pragmatic response, then nodded. We have at least 6 months of documented encounters. It potentially changes the divorce proceedings if we can establish infidelity. Good, I said, my mind already calculating how this new information fit into our overall approach. We hold this in reserve. Let Blake think this is purely about assets and business interests. The personal betrayal is our ace card. Dominique studied me with a mixture of admiration and concern. Most clients fall apart when I show them evidence like this. I did my falling apart in the hospital, I replied. Now I'm rebuilding, and part of that is seeing Blake clearly for who he is, not who I thought he was. As our meeting concluded, I felt a strange sense of liberation. Each revelation about Blake's deception, each piece of evidence Dominique uncovered, wasn't just building our legal case. It was dismantling the last of my emotional attachment to him. The man I had loved, the marriage I had valued, had been illusions. And while facing that truth was painful, it was also freeing. I was no longer fighting to save anything worth saving. I was simply ensuring that Blake wouldn't profit from his calculated cruelty. The next week passed in a carefully orchestrated rhythm of recovery and reconnaissance. My physical strength returned steadily, the surgical incisions healing cleanly according to the home health nurse. My strategic position strengthened in parallel as information flowed in from multiple channels. Lorna had met with Miranda for casual drinks that yielded surprising insights. Over mojitos and seemingly idle conversation, Miranda had mentioned Blake's frequent visits to the office during my business trips. He was always very interested in your client files, Lorna reported back, mimicking Miranda's slightly slurred confession. Used to spend hours in your office with the door closed. Said he was helping organize your paperwork, but Carrie always thought it was weird. This confirmed my growing suspicion that Blake had been mining my business for information, potentially client contacts, pricing structures, or proprietary methodologies I'd developed. The question was why. Was he planning to start a competing firm, sell information to competitors, or simply documenting everything to strengthen his claim on my business assets? I added it to my growing file of questions for Carrie to investigate discreetly. Meanwhile, Dominique's team had been tracing Blake's financial maneuvers with increasing precision. The Nevada LLC was just the beginning. There was a network of transfers, investments, and hidden accounts that painted a picture of systematic Financial concealment. He's been skimming from your joint accounts for at least 2 years, Dominique explained during our third strategy session. Small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums as he grew confident you wouldn't notice. I trusted him with the day-to-day finances, I admitted, feeling foolish in retrospect. I was focused on growing my business, and Blake always said he enjoyed handling our personal investments. It's a common dynamic, Dominique assured me, and one that many spouses exploit during divorce preparations. The good news is that forensic accounting can uncover most of these tricks. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Perry Connor, one of Blake's college friends who worked at his investment firm, reached out through my business, email, an address Blake wouldn't monitor. Elodie, I heard about the divorce from Blake. There are things you should know. I can't put them in writing, but I'm willing to meet. This isn't right. I forwarded the message to Dominique, who advised caution. It could be legitimate, or it could be Blake trying to gather information about your strategy. Let me arrange the meeting on neutral ground with my associate present. The meeting was set for the following day at Dominique's office, a deliberate choice that would signal to Blake, when Perry inevitably told him that I was taking a more active role in the divorce proceedings. It was time to start shifting the dynamic, to move from seemingly passive recovery to visible preparation. That night, I received another text from Blake. Stan tells me you're deferring all communication to Dominique. This is between us, Elodie. We don't need to make lawyers rich off our situation. Meet me for coffee, just to talk. His transparent attempt to circumvent legal channels was almost laughable. I showed the message to Lorna, who rolled her eyes dramatically. Translation. I'm terrified of what Dominique might find, so please meet me without legal representation so I can manipulate you like I always have, she said. Exactly, I agreed. But it's useful information. He's getting desperate. I didn't respond to the text, maintaining the information asymmetry that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for Blake. Let him wonder what I knew, what I was planning. Let him imagine worst-case scenarios while I methodically built my case. The meeting with Perry Connor proved invaluable. He arrived at Dominique's office looking nervous but determined, clutching a manila envelope. I'm taking a professional risk. Being here, he said after declining coffee. But what Blake is doing isn't just wrong, it's potentially illegal. Perry explained that Blake had been using his position at the investment firm to create artificial transactions, essentially paying himself consulting fees through client accounts, then diverting the money to his hidden assets. It started small, Perry explained. A few thousand here and there. But over the last year it's escalated. He's moved over $500,000 through these fake consultancy charges. He provided documentation showing the transactions, carefully structured to avoid triggering compliance flags. Why are you sharing this? Dominique asked, her tone professionally skeptical. Perry looked uncomfortable. Blake and I have been friends since college, but what he's doing could implicate the firm. And he hesitated. The way he talks about Elodie now, like she's an obstacle to be removed rather than his wife of 7 years. It's not right. After Perry left, Dominique was practically gleeful. This is exactly what we needed. Financial fraud changes everything. It's not just about dividing assets anymore. It's about Blake potentially facing criminal charges. I considered this new leverage carefully. We don't use it yet, I decided. We continue gathering evidence, building a comprehensive picture of his activities. When we do confront him, it needs to be with an airtight case. Dominique nodded approvingly. Patience is rare in divorce cases. Most clients want immediate vindication. I don't want vindication, I replied. I want justice, and that requires careful preparation. The next phase of preparation involved my business. With Carrie's help, I began documenting every aspect of the company's development that clearly excluded Blake's involvement. Client testimonials mentioning my personal expertise, development timelines for proprietary methodologies that predated our marriage, financial records showing the business. Growth resulted from my strategic decisions. Blake never even understood what we actually do, Carrie remarked as we reviewed the evidence during a video call. Remember when he tried to explain our strategic alignment methodology to the Hendricks Group and completely butchered it? They were so confused. I did remember. Blake had insisted on attending that meeting, claiming his business acumen would help close the deal. Instead, he'd misrepresented our approach so badly that I'd spent weeks rebuilding the client's confidence. Document that incident specifically, I told Carrie. It demonstrates his lack of meaningful contribution to the business. By the end of the week, we had assembled a formidable dossier refuting Blake's claims to my company. Combined with the financial evidence of his pre-divorce maneuvering and the potentially criminal fund diversions, we were building an overwhelming case. The final piece of preparation came from an unexpected angle. My hospital roommate during my second surgery had been a gossip columnist for a local lifestyle magazine. We'd bonded over shared gallows humor about hospital food and had kept in touch through social media. She messaged me privately, "Elodie, not sure if this matters, but I saw your husband at the Langham Hotel charity gala last weekend with a woman who was definitely not you. They seemed familiar. I have pictures if you need them." The timing of the gala was significant. It had occurred after Blake had served me with divorce papers, but before he knew I had retained Dominique. He had felt confident enough to appear publicly with Carissa, believing I was still isolated in the hospital, unaware and defenseless. "Add it to the file," I told Dominique when I forwarded the images. "It shows his state of mind, his confidence, that I wouldn't fight back effectively." With each piece of evidence, each documented betrayal, I felt myself growing stronger, not just physically, but emotionally and strategically. Blake had initiated this battle believing I was at my weakest point. He had no idea that he had actually awakened something in me that had been dormant throughout our marriage. The fighter who had put herself through college, who had built a business from nothing, who had survived far worse than a husband's betrayal. The second week of my recovery ended. I was ready to move from preparation to controlled action. It was time to let Blake know, in subtle but unmistakable ways, that his carefully constructed plan was about to unravel. 3 weeks after receiving divorce papers in my hospital bed, I returned to work. The decision was carefully calculated, earlier, than my doctor recommended, but precisely timed for maximum strategic impact. The office was on the 15th floor of a gleaming downtown high-rise, the entire space designed to my specifications when the business had expanded 2 years ago. Floor-to-ceiling windows, modern furnishings in cool blues and grays, and an atmosphere of quiet confidence that reflected the company's ethos. It felt good to be back, to reclaim this space that was unquestionably mine. Carrie met me at the elevator, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. "Are you sure you're ready for this? No one expects you back so soon." "I'm sure," I said, striding past the reception area where Miranda watched with barely concealed curiosity. "Is the team assembled for the morning briefing?" "Yes, but Elodie." Carrie lowered her voice. "Blake called yesterday, said he needed to drop by to collect some personal items from your office. I told him you were returning today and he seemed surprised." I smiled. "Perfect." The morning briefing proceeded normally. Project updates, client concerns, strategic priorities for the quarter. I presented a calm, composed front, making no mention of my health challenges or personal situation. The message was clear. Elodie, Harrington was firmly in control. As the meeting concluded, I addressed the elephant in the room with clinical precision. As some of you may have heard, my husband Blake and I are divorcing. This will not affect our operations or client relationships. I appreciate your discretion regarding this personal matter. No emotional details, no bid for sympathy. Just a straightforward acknowledgement that closed the door on office speculation, while sending an unmistakable message to Blake when word inevitably reached him. I was not hiding, not retreating, and certainly not broken. After the meeting, I retreated to my office and closed the door, allowing myself a moment to breathe through the dull pain in my abdomen. The doctors had warned against returning to work so soon, but some battles required personal sacrifice. Appearances mattered, and the appearance of strength was crucial to my strategy. My office remained exactly as I'd left it before my hospitalization. Desk meticulously organized, filing cabinets locked, computer secured. If Blake had indeed been searching through my files during my absence, he'd been careful to leave no trace. But Carrie had taken precautions, changing all digital passwords and installing a discreet security camera after I'd confided my suspicions. At precisely 11:30, my assistant knocked gently. "Ms. Harrington, you have a call on line 1. It's Mr. Winters, right on schedule." Blake had undoubtedly heard about my return and couldn't resist making contact. I waited 3 rings before picking up, a small but deliberate demonstration that he wasn't my priority. "This is Elodie." My voice was professional, neither warm nor hostile. "You're back at work." Blake's tone conveyed surprise tinged with something else, anxiety perhaps. "Your doctors can't possibly have cleared you so soon. My medical decisions are no longer your concern, Blake." I kept my voice even, matter of fact. "What can I help you with?" He seemed thrown by my composure. "I need to collect some personal items from the house, and we should talk, Elodie. This divorce doesn't need to be adversarial." "Any items you need from the house can be arranged through our attorneys," I replied. "As for talking, I believe your initial approach, serving papers to my hospital bed, established the tone of these proceedings. I regret the timing," he said, an uncharacteristic hesitation in his voice. "Things got out of hand. But Elodie, you need to know that Dominique St. Clair has a reputation for scorched earth tactics. She's not known for amicable resolutions. How fortunate, then, that I'm not seeking an amicable resolution." I allowed a hint of steel to enter my voice. "I'm seeking an equitable one." Blake's sharp intake of breath was audible. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means that my attorney will be in touch regarding our next steps. Good day, Blake." I hung up before he could respond, then immediately emailed Dominique. "Blake called as predicted, expressed concerns about your reputation, and attempted to arrange a meeting outside legal channels. Seemed unsettled by my return to work. Proceeding to next phase." The next phase was a series of subtle but significant moves designed to increase Blake's anxiety level while maintaining my appearance of calm normalcy. First, I scheduled a very public lunch with Claire Donovan, the managing partner at Blake's firm. She and I had served on a nonprofit board together years ago, and while not close friends, we maintained a cordial professional relationship. Blake would inevitably learn of the meeting and wonder what we had discussed, whether his professional standing might be compromised by his personal actions. Next, I instructed Carrie to reach out to our most significant clients, scheduling check-in, calls that I would personally handle. This served dual purposes, reassuring clients about the company's stability despite my recent absence, and demonstrating to Blake that his assumptions about my diminished capacity were unfounded. Finally, I returned to the house, our house, for the first time since my hospitalization. The decision was both practical and psychological. I needed to retrieve more clothes and personal items, but more importantly, I needed to reclaim the space Blake thought he had successfully driven me from. Lorna drove me there in the early evening, insisting on accompanying me inside despite my assurances that I could manage alone. "I don't trust that man," she said firmly as we pulled into the circular driveway. "And neither should you." The house stood silent and imposing in the fading light, a modernist structure of glass and steel that had never felt particularly warm, even in the best days of our marriage. I used my key, not yet changed apparently, and stepped into the soaring entry hall. Evidence of Blake's continued residence was everywhere. His briefcase on the console table, a half-empty whiskey tumbler, On the kitchen counter, financial papers spread across the dining table. He was working late at the office according to his predictable schedule, another calculated aspect of my timing. I moved through the house with purpose, gathering clothes, jewelry, important documents I'd kept in my home office. Lorna followed, carrying an expanding file folder I'd asked her to bring. "What exactly are we looking for?" she whispered, though we were alone in the house. "Anything that doesn't belong," I replied, opening Blake's desk drawer with a key he didn't know I possessed. The drawer contained the usual office supplies, a passport, checkbooks, and a small black leather notebook I hadn't seen before. I flipped it open, finding handwritten notes in Blake's distinctive scrawl, lists of dates, dollar amounts, and cryptic annotations. "Gotcha," I murmured, slipping the notebook into my purse before continuing my methodical search. In the primary bedroom, I opened my jewelry box, confirming that my grandmother's pieces, the collection Blake had pushed me to sell, remained intact. I selected several significant pieces but deliberately left others behind, creating the impression of someone retrieving personal items rather than moving out permanently. As we prepared to leave, I made one final calculated move. I rearranged several items on Blake's nightstand, moving his watch, turning his book to a different page, repositioning the lamp. Nothing dramatic, just subtle changes that would leave him wondering if he was imagining things or if someone had been in his space. "Psychological warfare?" Lorna asked, observing with raised eyebrows. "Pattern disruption," I corrected. "Blake thrives on control and predictability. Small, unexplained changes will unsettle him more than grand gestures." As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of our neighbor Connor watching from his front porch. He raised his hand in a hesitant wave, which I returned with deliberate nonchalance. Another witness who would undoubtedly mention my visit to Blake, adding to the calculated impression that I was carrying on with calm determination, rather than reeling from his betrayal. Back at Lorna's apartment, I examined the black notebook, more thoroughly, photographing each page before sending the images to Dominique with a brief message. "Found in Blake's desk. Appears to document transfers and timelines. Note the dates. They align perfectly with his increased interest in my business financials." This phase of apparent calm, returning to work, proceeding with normal activities, making no dramatic moves, was perhaps the most difficult part of my strategy. Every instinct urged confrontation, demanded immediate justice. But patience would yield far greater results in the end. Let Blake wonder what I knew, what I was planning. Let him grow increasingly uneasy as his expected narrative of me collapsed in grief or rage failed to materialize. Let him make mistakes, born of anxiety and uncertainty. The deceptive calm before the storm was, in its way, the storm itself. The carefully choreographed dance of divorce negotiations requires more than just legal strategy and financial acumen. It demands allies, people strategically positioned to provide support, information, and validation when needed most. My approach to building these alliances was as methodical as every other aspect of my response to Blake's betrayal. My first key alliance was already in place. Dominique St. Clair, whose formidable reputation alone had visibly rattled Blake. But legal representation, while crucial, was just one piece of a complex puzzle. "We need to consider bringing in specialized support," Dominique advised during our fourth strategy session. "A forensic accountant to track Blake's financial maneuvers, potentially a private investigator to document his ongoing relationship with Carissa, and a business valuation expert to counter any claims against your company." I agreed without hesitation. Each expert would serve as both shield and sword in the battles ahead. For the forensic accounting, Dominique recommended Miranda Feldman, a former IRS investigator with a reputation for uncovering even the most sophisticated financial deceptions. "She's not cheap," Dominique warned, "but she's thorough and court-credible. Judges trust her assessments." I authorized the expense immediately. Blake has had years to hide assets. We need someone who can find what he doesn't want found. Miranda, began work the following day, armed with bank statements, tax returns, and the black notebook I'd discovered in Blake's desk. Her preliminary findings confirmed our suspicions. Blake had been systematically diverting funds through a complex network of accounts and investments, preparing his financial exit long before serving divorce papers. "He's made mistakes," Miranda reported during our first meeting. "Classic ones, actually. People think they're being clever with their shell companies and private accounts, but money leaves traces. Always." The business valuation expert came through Carrie's network, Gary Whitman, who specialized in assessing privately held consulting firms. His role was crucial, as Blake's claim to my business hinged on inflating his contributions while simultaneously undervaluing the company's worth. "I've seen this dynamic before," Gary commented after reviewing our company structure. "Spouses often claim they were strategic partners in businesses they barely understood. We'll create a clear timeline showing the company's growth relative to his actual documented involvement. With these professional alliances in place, I turned to more personal connections, relationships that would provide both emotional support and strategic advantages in the less formal arenas where divorce battles often play out: social circles, industry networks, and community standing. My first priority was securing loyalty within my own company. While Carrie was unquestionably in my corner, other employees might be vulnerable to Blake's manipulation, particularly if he portrayed himself as the wronged party. I scheduled individual meetings with each department head, ostensibly to catch up after my medical absence, but actually to subtly gauge their understanding of the situation and reinforce their connection to me rather than Blake. "I want to be transparent," I told each of them. "My personal situation is changing, but my commitment to this company and to each of you remains absolute. If you hear rumors or receive overtures from outside parties, including my soon-to-be ex-husband, I'd appreciate being informed." The approach worked beautifully. Within days, 2 employees reported that Blake had contacted them, fishing for information about company projects and client relationships. These attempts revealed both his desperation and his continued underestimation of my influence within my own organization. Beyond the company, I focused on key social relationships that Blake might attempt to leverage. We shared many friends and professional contacts, individuals who would inevitably be drawn into the divorce narrative one way or another. Rather than allowing Blake to control this narrative, I selected 5 key people in our social circle, those with the greatest influence and connection to others, and arranged casual one-on-one meetings. Coffee with Elaine Mitchell, whose husband partnered with Blake on investment deals. Lunch with Dr. Perry, who had treated both of us for years and whose opinion carried weight in our community. A gallery opening with Jordan and Steph Freeman, whose annual charity gala was a center of our social calendar. In each interaction, I was careful not to appear vindictive or emotionally fragile. I offered no salacious details, no character assassinations. Instead, I presented simple facts with dignified restraint. "Blake and I are divorcing," I would say when the subject inevitably arose. "It's a difficult time, particularly given my recent health challenges, but I'm focusing on recovery and moving forward. I value our friendship and hope it can continue, independent of my marital situation." This approach created a stark contrast to Blake's behavior. While I took the high road, Blake was becoming increasingly indiscreet about his relationship with Carissa, appearing at restaurants and events with her barely a month after serving divorce papers. The timing was not lost on our social circle, particularly when juxtaposed with my recent surgeries and hospitalization. The most unexpected alliance came from Rebecca Winters, Blake's first wife. We had never met during my marriage to Blake, an absence I had never questioned but now recognized as deliberately engineered by him. Through a careful approach facilitated by Dominique, I arranged a discreet meeting at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Rebecca was striking, elegant, composed, with an incisive intelligence that immediately dispelled any notion that she had been a naive victim in her divorce from Blake. I wondered if you'd reach out, she said after we exchanged pleasantries. The pattern is remarkably consistent. Pattern? I asked, though I already suspected what she meant. Blake's exit strategy. The gradual distance, the financial maneuvering, the timing calculated for maximum advantage. She stirred her tea with measured precision. Those serving papers while you were hospitalized, that's a new low, even for him. Over the next hour, Rebecca outlined her own experience with Blake. A marriage that had ended 8 years ago when Blake discovered she had inherited significant property from her grandfather. He suddenly became very interested in joint ownership arrangements, she explained. Wanted everything in both names, for tax purposes. When I resisted, the marriage deteriorated rapidly. Her insights provided valuable context for understanding Blake's long-term patterns of behavior and financial motivations. More importantly, Rebecca offered to provide a formal statement detailing Blake's similar financial maneuvers during their divorce, evidence that would establish a history of deceptive practices rather than isolated incidents. As I built these alliances, professional, social, and strategic, I maintained the appearance of someone focused on recovery and rebuilding rather than revenge. This perception was itself a form of power. While Blake grew increasingly erratic, making impulsive moves to counter what he imagined I might be planning, I moved with steady purpose, each alliance strengthening my position for the confrontation to come. The most powerful message to Blake came not through direct communication, but through the visible network of support forming around me. When he saw me having lunch with his firm's managing partner, when mutual friends subtly distanced themselves from him, when his first wife emerged from the shadows of his past, each instance chipped away at his confidence, his certainty that he had the upper hand. A divorce is never just a legal proceeding, it's a realignment of relationships, a redrawing of social maps. By methodically building alliances across multiple spheres, I wasn't just preparing for legal battle, I was reclaiming narrative control and establishing the foundation for my post-Blake life. The alliance-building phase culminated in a moment I hadn't planned but couldn't have orchestrated better if I had. At an industry award dinner I attended with Carrie, I encountered Blake and Carissa. Rather than avoiding the awkward situation, I approached their table with composed confidence, extended my hand to a visibly uncomfortable Carissa, and said, simply, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Elodie Harrington. The whispers that rippled through the room, the stunned expression on Blake's face, the way Carissa's smile froze in place, all confirmed that the alliances I had built were shifting the power dynamics dramatically. I was no longer the wronged wife in a hospital bed. I was a force to be reckoned with, and Blake was beginning to realize just how badly he had miscalculated. 5 weeks after receiving divorce papers in my hospital bed, the carefully maintained equilibrium began to shift. Like tectonic plates that move imperceptibly until they suddenly release enormous energy, my restrained strategy was about to face its first major test. The catalyst was Blake's financial maneuvers. Having realized that his initial attempts to pressure me into a quick settlement had failed, he made a classic desperate move, attempting to restrict my access to financial resources while the divorce proceeded. It began with a notice from our joint investment account, a substantial portfolio that had funded major expenses like property taxes and home renovations. The account had been frozen at Blake's request, citing disputed marital assets under litigation. This same account contained funds earmarked for my business's quarterly tax payment, a timing that couldn't be coincidental. He's trying to force a cash flow crisis, Dominique observed when I forwarded the notice. It's a common tactic when more subtle approaches have failed. I had anticipated this possibility and had already moved sufficient funds to cover immediate business needs, but Blake's actions signaled an important transition, from manipulation to outright financial aggression. Time to implement countermeasures? I asked. Dominique nodded. Precisely. But remember, We respond with calculated precision, not emotional reaction. Our first counter was straightforward: an emergency motion for temporary financial orders, requesting the court to unfreeze essential accounts and prohibit further unilateral actions by either party pending final divorce settlement. This standard legal procedure sent an important message. Blake's financial maneuvers would be met with immediate, appropriate legal responses. The second counter was more strategic, with Miranda Feldman's forensic accounting now substantiating significant financial concealment. We filed a formal discovery request demanding complete documentation of all accounts, transactions, and assets under Blake's control, including the Nevada LLC and the Lake Tahoe property he'd tried to keep hidden. This forces him to either disclose everything, effectively admitting to financial deception, or commit perjury by providing incomplete information, Dominique explained. Either way, he loses ground. Blake's response came through Connor Mills. Within hours, an aggressively worded settlement proposal that would give me a generous one-time payment in exchange for relinquishing all claims to ongoing support, business interests, and property holdings. He's panicking, Dominique observed with professional satisfaction, trying to buy his way out before full financial disclosure. We declined the offer without counter-proposal, maintaining the pressure of pending discovery proceedings. The next day, I received an unexpected visitor at the office. Stella Martinez, Blake's executive assistant for the past 5 years, requested a private meeting through Carrie. Cautious but curious, I agreed to see her during lunch hours. Stella arrived looking nervous but determined, clutching a large envelope. "I've worked for Blake since he joined the firm," she began after declining coffee. "I've always prided myself on loyalty and discretion, but there are limits." She explained that Blake had recently asked her to backdate several consulting contracts, documents supposedly proving his independent business activities predating certain asset acquisitions. "It's fraud," she said simply, "and I won't be part of it." The envelope contained copies of the original contracts with their true dates, alongside the falsified versions Blake had prepared for potential court submission. It was compelling evidence of deliberate deception, potentially enough to trigger not just divorce penalties, but professional ethics investigations. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "Because what he's doing isn't just wrong professionally, it's wrong personally," Stella replied. "The way he spoke about you after your surgery, like you were an inconvenience rather than his wife. I've seen a side of him I can't respect." I thanked her for her courage, promised confidentiality regarding her involvement, and immediately called Dominique. "This changes our timeline," Dominique said after reviewing Stella's documents. "With evidence of potential fraud, we can request expedited discovery and possibly a forensic audit of his professional practice." The escalation continued the following day, when Blake attempted a different approach. I returned from a client meeting to find him waiting in the reception area of my office, impeccably dressed and wearing the charming smile that had once seemed genuine, but now appeared as calculated as everything else about him. "Elodie," he said, rising as if we were meeting for a business lunch rather than navigating a contentious divorce. "You look well. Recovery agrees with you." "What do you want, Blake?" I kept my voice neutral but firm, conscious of the curious eyes of my staff. "5 minutes of your time. In private." His tone suggested reasonableness, but the slight tension in his jaw revealed his agitation. Strategic considerations flashed through my mind. Refusing the meeting might make me appear fearful or unreasonable to observing staff. Agreeing gave Blake what he wanted, but also provided an opportunity to assess his state of mind directly. 5 minutes, I agreed, leading him to my office. I left the door partially open, both a security measure and a signal that this was not a confidential reconciliation. Once inside, Blake's facade cracked slightly. "This has gotten out of hand, Elodie. The legal maneuvering, the forensic accountants, it's unnecessary and destructive." "I disagree," I replied calmly. I think it's precisely what's necessary when one party attempts to conceal assets and fabricate documents. His eyes widened fractionally. Confirmation that he hadn't expected me to know about the backdated contracts. I don't know what you think you've discovered, he said carefully. But I can assure you, my financial disclosures have been complete and accurate. We both know that's not true, Blake. I held his gaze steadily. The Nevada LLC, the Lake Tahoe, property, the diverted consulting fees, should I continue? The color drained from his face, replaced by a flush of anger. You've been investigating me? Just as you've been investigating me for years, apparently. The difference is, my methods are legal. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Be reasonable, Elodie. Dragging this through the courts benefits no one but the lawyers. I'm prepared to be generous if we can settle this quickly and quietly. Define generous, I replied, professionally curious. The condo downtown. $1 million in cash. Clean break. No ongoing entanglements. The offer was insultingly inadequate, given our marital assets, but more revealing was what it omitted. Any mention of his claims to my business. This confirmed my suspicion that those claims had been leverage rather than genuine financial objectives. Your 5 minutes are up, I said, rising from my chair. Any further settlement discussions should go through Dominique. As he left, Blake turned at the door. You've changed, Elodie. No, I corrected him. I've simply stopped accepting your version of reality. This confrontation, while brief, marked a significant escalation. Blake had abandoned legal channels to approach me directly, a sign of increasing desperation. Moreover, his settlement offer revealed both financial pressure and strategic retreat from certain claims. That evening, the escalation took an even more dramatic turn. Blake appeared unannounced at Lorna's apartment, demanding to speak with me. Lorna, furious at his presumption, called me while physically blocking her doorway. He's had a few drinks, she reported in a stage whisper Blake could clearly hear, and he's saying he won't leave until you talk to him. After consulting quickly with Dominique, I agreed to speak with Blake, but only by phone, with Lorna recording the conversation with her phone's voice memo function. You've turned everyone against me, Blake began without preamble, his words slightly slurred. Claire won't even discuss my partnership track anymore. Rebecca is suddenly giving statements to your lawyer. What did you tell them? The truth, I replied simply, which is apparently something you find threatening. I built you, Elodie, he said, his tone darkening. Your business, your social standing, none of it would exist without me. You were nothing when we met. There it was, the ugly truth beneath. The charming exterior. Not anger at losing me, but fury at losing control over me. Thank you for clarifying your perspective, I said, my voice steady despite the chill his words sent through me. I'll be sure to include this conversation in our court documentation. Blake must have realized his tactical error immediately. Elodie, wait! I didn't mean I ended the call, then immediately texted Dominique. Blake just revealed his true feelings on a recorded call. We now have evidence of his perception of my business as something he built and owned. Moving to next. Phase? Dominique's response was immediate. Perfect timing. File the comprehensive discovery motions tomorrow. It's time to bring everything into the light. The initial shock of betrayal had evolved into a calculated chess match, and Blake had just compromised his queen. The critical escalation wasn't about emotional outbursts or dramatic confrontations. It was about forcing Blake into positions where his own actions revealed his true character and intentions. As Lorna commented later that evening, he thought he was playing poker while holding all the cards. He didn't realize you were playing chess and thinking 5 moves ahead. In any strategic conflict, there comes a moment when opportunity and preparation intersect, a perfect alignment that cannot be manufactured but must be recognized and seized. For me, that moment arrived unexpectedly on a rainy Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after Blake had served me divorce papers in my hospital bed. I was reviewing quarterly projections with Carrie when Miranda, my office manager, appeared at the door, with an unusual expression, a mixture of confusion and barely suppressed excitement. "Ms. Harrington, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent and personal." Miranda lowered her voice. "She says her name is Carissa Powell." The name hung in the air between us, its significance unmistakable. Carissa Powell, the investment banker Blake had been seeing, the woman in the surveillance photos, the presumed catalyst for Blake's decision to end our marriage. "Did she have an appointment?" I asked, my voice calm despite the surge of adrenaline. "No, ma'am. She just arrived and insisted on seeing you immediately." I exchanged a glance with Carrie, whose eyebrows had practically disappeared into her hairline. "Show her in," I decided. "And Carrie, would you mind staying?" Having a witness to this unexpected encounter seemed prudent, particularly given the legal proceedings in motion. Whatever Carissa's purpose in coming here, documentation would be valuable. Carissa Powell was younger than me by perhaps 5 years, expensively dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of significant financial success. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms, but as she entered my office, I noted the slight uncertainty in her eyes, a hairline crack in an otherwise impeccable facade. "Ms. Harrington," she began, extending her hand. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment. I'm Carissa Powell." "I know who you are," I replied, accepting her handshake briefly. "What can I do for you, Ms. Powell?" She glanced at Carrie, clearly expecting a private conversation. "Carrie is my business partner," I explained, not offering to exclude her. "Anything you need to discuss can be said in front of her." Carissa hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "Very well. I'm here because there are things you should know about Blake, about your husband, that might be relevant to your situation." "You mean my divorce?" I kept my voice neutral, giving nothing away. "Yes." She placed her designer handbag on the chair beside her and removed a manila envelope. "I was under certain impressions about your marriage and Blake's financial situation that I've recently discovered were incomplete." The careful language of someone navigating potentially dangerous waters. "Interesting. What exactly are you here to tell me, Ms. Powell?" I asked directly. Carissa's professional composure faltered slightly. "Blake told me you were divorcing him, that you had fallen in love with someone else during a business trip to Tokyo, that you had already moved out when you became ill." I allowed myself a slight smile. "As you can see, I'm very much alive despite my illness. Did Blake happen to mention that he served me divorce papers while I was recovering from emergency surgery?" Her expression confirmed he had not. "He also claimed," she continued, looking increasingly uncomfortable, "that your business was failing, that he had been propping it up financially for years." At this, Carrie made a sound somewhere between a cough and a laugh. I silenced her with a glance. "And you discovered these claims were false?" I prompted. "Yes, quite dramatically false." Carissa opened the envelope and removed several documents. "I'm an investment banker, Ms. Harrington. Due diligence is literally my job. When Blake proposed certain joint investments, I conducted my standard background research." The documents she placed on my desk included financial statements, property, records, and what appeared to be communications between Blake and his attorney, Connor Mills. "Blake isn't just misleading you," she said, her professional demeanor fully restored. "He's been misleading me, his firm, and possibly financial institutions regarding his assets and liabilities." I scanned the documents quickly, immediately, recognizing their significance. Blake had apparently represented himself to Carissa as having sole ownership of properties that were marital assets, had claimed income levels significantly higher than reality, and had discussed strategies for asset concealment that bordered on illegal. "Why are you sharing this with me?" I asked, though the answer was becoming clear. "Self-preservation," she replied frankly. I won't be collateral damage in someone else's financial deception. Moreover, some of these misrepresentations could constitute fraud if used to secure investments or loans. The perfect moment had arrived, not through my planning but through Blake's own overreaching. In attempting to impress Carissa with inflated claims of wealth and property, he had created evidence that directly contradicted his court filings in our divorce. "May I keep these?" I asked, indicating the documents. "They're copies," Carissa confirmed. "Do with them what you need to." As she prepared to leave, Carissa hesitated at the door. "For what it's worth, I didn't know about your hospitalization or the true state of your marriage when I became involved with Blake. I wouldn't have—" She stopped herself. "Well, that hardly matters now." After she departed, Carrie turned to me with wide eyes. "Did that just happen? Did Blake's girlfriend just hand you the smoking gun in your divorce case?" "It appears so," I replied, already reaching for my phone to call Dominique. Blake finally outsmarted himself. Within an hour, Dominique arrived at my office, reviewing Carissa's documents with increasing satisfaction. "This is extraordinary," she said, tapping a particular document showing Blake's claims of sole ownership of our primary residence. "He's submitted sworn statements to the court, claiming these exact properties are contested marital assets, while simultaneously representing them to Ms. Powell as his exclusive property. Can we use this?" I asked. "Use it?" "Elodie, this is game-changing. It's one thing to engage in aggressive negotiation tactics during divorce. It's entirely another to commit what amounts to perjury and potential financial fraud. The strategy crystallized immediately. We would request an emergency hearing before the judge overseeing our divorce, presenting evidence of Blake's contradictory financial representations and requesting immediate freezing of all assets pending criminal investigation. "This is the moment to strike decisively," Dominique advised. "No warnings, no opportunities for Blake to create explanations or counter-narratives." The legal machinery moved with surprising speed. By late afternoon, our emergency petition was filed, with a hearing scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning. Blake would receive formal notification that evening, his first indication that his carefully constructed financial house of cards was collapsing. As predicted, Blake's response was immediate and panicked. A flurry of calls and texts began around 7 p.m., growing increasingly desperate as the evening progressed. 3 p.m. "Elodie, we need to talk immediately. Call me." 7:24 p.m. "This is a misunderstanding. Please call before things escalate unnecessarily." 8:16 p.m. "What did Carissa tell you?" "Whatever it was, it's not the full picture." 9:32 p.m. "You're making a serious mistake. There are explanations for everything." I forwarded each message to Dominique without responding. Blake's growing desperation only confirmed we had found his vulnerability, the point where his parallel deceptions intersected and contradicted each other. That night, as I prepared for the next day's hearing, I experienced a strange sense of calm. The perfect moment hadn't come from a brilliant strategic maneuver on my part, but from Blake's fundamental character flaw, his belief that he could control separate narratives indefinitely without them ever colliding. "You look different," Lorna observed as I reviewed my notes for the hearing. "More, I don't know, centered?" "I feel different," I acknowledged. "For weeks I've been reacting to Blake's moves, even when those reactions were strategic. Tomorrow, for the first time, I'm the one forcing his hand." The perfect moment wasn't about revenge or even justice in the conventional sense. It was about truth finally emerging, undeniable, documented truth that cut through months of manipulation and deception. As I laid out my clothes for the hearing, a conservative navy suit that conveyed both authority and appropriate gravity, I reflected on the journey from that hospital bed to this moment of reckoning. Blake had chosen what he thought was my weakest moment to strike. He couldn't have known that in doing so, he had actually catalyzed my greatest strength. the clarity that comes from seeing someone's true nature without illusion or sentiment clouding the view. Tomorrow would be Blake's day of reckoning, not because I had orchestrated an elaborate trap, but because his own actions had finally caught up with him. The perfect moment had arrived not through my manipulation, but through his. The courtroom carried that distinct institutional atmosphere: polished wood, subdued colors, and an air of formality that demanded respect. I arrived 30 minutes early, with Dominique, taking our places at the plaintiff's table with methodical precision. Every detail mattered today, from my conservative attire to the organized presentation of our evidence. "Remember," Dominique murmured as we arranged our materials, "Judge Keller is known for her no-nonsense approach and particular attention to financial disclosures. She despises being misled." I nodded, feeling strangely calm despite the significance of the moment. My medical recovery was still ongoing. A dull ache in my abdomen reminded me of just how recently I'd been hospitalized, but my mental clarity was absolute. At precisely 8:55, Blake entered with Connor Mills. I observed them without turning. My head, noting Blake's appearance through my peripheral vision. He was impeccably dressed as always, but subtle signs betrayed his distress. The slightly loosened tie, the uncharacteristic tension around his eyes, the way he leaned toward Connor, with urgent whispers. For a moment, our eyes met across the courtroom. Blake attempted a smile, that same charming expression that had once seemed genuine, but now appeared as artificial as a mannequin's. I responded with nothing but a level gaze before returning my attention to the documents before me. Judge Keller entered promptly at 9 CUAS, her brisk efficiency setting the tone immediately. "I've reviewed the emergency petition," she began after the formalities, "and find sufficient cause for this hearing. Ms. St. Clair, please present your evidence regarding the alleged financial misrepresentations." Dominique rose with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, we have documented evidence that Mr. Winters has made contradictory statements about asset ownership and financial status in legal proceedings versus other contexts. Specifically, he has represented certain properties as contested, marital assets in these divorce proceedings while simultaneously claiming sole ownership of these same assets in communications with financial partners." She presented the documents Carissa had provided, alongside Blake's sworn statements from our divorce filing, highlighting the direct contradictions with methodical precision. Judge Keller reviewed the materials with increasing gravity, occasionally glancing at Blake over her reading glasses. "Mr. Mills, how do you explain these discrepancies?" she finally asked. Connor Mills stood, affecting a casual confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your Honor, these are simply misunderstandings arising from informal communications. In business contexts, individuals often speak of jointly owned properties in shorthand as my house or my vacation property. There was no intent to mislead." "Interesting theory," Judge Keller replied dryly. "However, these documents include specific ownership percentages and valuation claims that directly contradict sworn statements to this court. That goes beyond casual phrasing." I watched Blake, shifting uncomfortably in his seat as Connor attempted to construct a plausible explanation. The power dynamics were visibly realigning. Blake, accustomed to controlling situations through charm and financial leverage, was discovering that neither held sway in this environment. Judge Keller turned her attention to Blake directly. "Mr. Winters, did you represent to Ms. Powell that you held sole ownership of the property at 1427 Lakeshore Drive?" Blake cleared his throat. "Your Honor, in the context of those discussions, yes or no will suffice, Mr. Winters?" A moment of silence hung in the air. "Yes," Blake finally admitted. "And in your financial disclosures to this court, dated 6 weeks ago, did you list this same property as jointly owned marital property?" "Yes, but thank you." Judge Keller turned back to the documents, reviewing them with methodical thoroughness before delivering her ruling. The court finds sufficient evidence of material misrepresentation to warrant immediate protective measures. All assets listed in these proceedings are hereby frozen pending full financial disclosure and potential referral for further investigation. Neither party may transfer, encumber, or dispose of any property or accounts until this matter is resolved. She fixed Blake with a stern look. Mr. Winters, the court takes financial transparency with the utmost seriousness. Any further discrepancies will be viewed most unfavorably. The hearing concluded within 40 minutes, brief by court standards, but devastating in its impact. As we gathered our materials, I could feel Blake's eyes on me, his desperation almost palpable across the courtroom. Outside in the corridor, he finally approached, maneuvering to intercept me despite Dominique's protective presence. "Elodie, this has gone too far," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You've made your point. Let's resolve this like reasonable people." I regarded him calmly, noting the unfamiliar anxiety in his expression. This was Blake stripped of his usual advantages, his financial leverage restricted, his credibility damaged, his carefully cultivated image of success and control crumbling visibly. "I am being reasonable, Blake," I replied. "I'm simply ensuring that our divorce proceeds with full financial transparency." "Isn't that what you would want?" The subtle emphasis on his documented deception wasn't lost on him. His jaw tightened momentarily before he forced another smile. "This approach benefits no one, Elodie. The legal fees alone will deplete the very assets we're arguing over." "Actually," Dominique interjected smoothly, "given the court's findings today, there's a strong possibility that Ms. Harrington can petition for Mr. Winters to cover all legal expenses related to uncovering financial misrepresentation. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Mills?" Connor Mills, approaching from behind Blake, didn't bother hiding his grimace. "We should discuss settlement options," he conceded. "We'll review any written proposals," Dominique replied, effectively ending the conversation as she guided me toward the exit. In the car afterward, Dominique allowed herself a rare moment of unprofessional satisfaction. "That," she said with a smile, "was textbook. Judge Keller's asset freeze order is comprehensive. Blake can't access the Tahoe property funds, the Nevada accounts, or even his regular investment portfolio without court approval." "What happens next?" I asked, watching the courthouse recede. In the side mirror, "Next, we wait precisely 72 hours, she replied. Long enough for Blake to feel the full impact of financial restriction, to consult with Connor about his deteriorating legal position, and to recognize that his only viable path forward is a settlement that acknowledges his deception. And if he doesn't, then we proceed to Phase 2. Depositions of his colleagues regarding the potentially fraudulent consulting fees, forensic accounting testimony about the Nevada transfers, and Carissa Powell's sworn statement regarding his financial misrepresentations to her. The power shift wasn't just legal, it was psychological. Blake had initiated our divorce from a position of presumed dominance, calculating that my illness would leave me vulnerable and compliant. Now, 6 weeks later, he was the one facing vulnerability on multiple fronts: professional reputation, financial security, and potentially even legal jeopardy. That evening, as predicted, Blake's settlement overtures began, first through Connor Mills, then through increasingly desperate direct messages. 15 p.m. Elodie, this has gotten completely out of hand. Let's talk directly and find a reasonable solution. 2 p.m. I'm prepared to be extremely generous. The house, the cabin, a significant cash settlement. Just call off the financial investigation. 10:47 p.m. What do you want, Elodie? Just tell me what it will take to end this. Each message revealed his growing recognition of his untenable position. His generous offers increased with each communication, as did his evident anxiety about the financial investigation. I forwarded each message to Dominique without response, maintaining the strategic silence that had served us well throughout this process. Blake's growing desperation would only accelerate over the coming days as the reality of the asset freeze impacted his daily life and professional activities. The power shift was complete. From the moment Blake had calculated that my hospital bed was the perfect place to serve divorce papers, he had been operating under a fundamental misconception: that physical vulnerability equated to strategic vulnerability, that my medical recovery would prevent effective response to his legal and financial maneuvers. He couldn't have been more wrong. The hospital room had not been my weakest moment, but his. The point at which he had revealed his true character and priorities with such clarity that no emotional attachment could survive the revelation. As Lorna observed when I showed her Blake's increasingly panicked messages, he thought he was dealing with the Elodie he created in his mind, the compliant, grateful wife. He never actually knew the real Elodie, the strategic thinker, the survivor, the woman who built a business from nothing while he was still trading on his family name. The power had shifted not because I had seized it through dramatic confrontation, but because Blake had surrendered it through his own miscalculations and overreach. The perfect symmetry of this reversal wasn't lost on me. Blake had initiated our divorce believing me powerless in a hospital bed, and now found himself effectively powerless in the face of his own documented deception. The board had been reset, the game transformed, and Blake was only beginning to understand how completely the rules had changed. The formal settlement meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning in the neutral territory of Dominique's conference room. The 72-hour waiting period had worked precisely as intended. Blake's increasing financial restrictions had created the perfect pressure point, compelling him toward resolution while minimizing his negotiating leverage. I arrived early, taking a moment alone in the elegant space to center myself. The wall-to-wall windows offered a commanding view of the city skyline, a visual reminder of perspective and scale. My personal drama, however consuming it had felt these past weeks, was just one small story playing out in a vast landscape of human experience. Dominique joined me, impeccable as always in a tailored charcoal suit that projected both authority and restrained elegance. "Are you ready?" she asked, arranging her materials with practiced precision. "Completely," I replied, surprised to find it was true. The confrontation ahead didn't provoke anxiety or dread, just a calm determination to reach appropriate closure. Blake and Connor Mills arrived precisely on time, escorted by Dominique's assistant. The contrast between them was immediately apparent, Connor projecting professional detachment, while Blake radiated barely controlled tension. His usually immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of strain: a missed spot while shaving, slight shadows under his eyes, a tie knot not quite centered. "Good morning," Dominique began, her tone coolly professional. "We're here to discuss settlement parameters based on full financial disclosure and equitable division of marital assets." Connor nodded, opening his portfolio. "We've prepared a comprehensive proposal that we believe addresses all outstanding issues." He distributed bound documents containing Blake's latest settlement offer. I accepted mine without comment, noting it was significantly more substantial than his previous proposals, a tacit acknowledgement of his weakened position. As I reviewed the terms, I maintained a neutral expression despite the victory they represented. Blake was now offering full ownership of our primary residence, a substantial cash settlement, and most critically, a complete retraction of any claims against my business. "This seems workable as a starting framework," Dominique commented after her own review. "However, there are several areas requiring adjustment before Ms. Harrington could consider acceptance." She proceeded to outline counter terms: increased financial settlement to account for the documented hidden assets, guarantees against future claims, and a non-disparagement clause protecting my professional reputation. Each point was presented not as a demand, but as a logical consequence of Blake's previous actions. Throughout this exchange, Blake remained uncharacteristically silent, leaving the negotiation to Connor while watching me with an intensity I found curious rather than unsettling. He seemed to be searching for something in my demeanor, perhaps anger or triumph or lingering emotional attachment. He would find none of these. After 90 minutes of methodical negotiation, most major points had been resolved. Connor requested a brief recess to consult privately with Blake, and Dominique agreed. "This is proceeding well," she observed after they left the room. "Blake is accepting terms he would have found unthinkable 6 weeks ago." "Because he has no choice," I noted. "The financial investigation has revealed too much." When Blake and Connor returned, there was a subtle shift in the dynamic. Connor resumed his seat, but Blake remained standing, his posture suggesting he had something to say beyond the settlement terms. "Before we continue," he began, his voice carefully modulated, "I'd like to speak directly to Elodie. Just for a moment." Dominique raised an eyebrow. "Any communication can be made with counsel present." "I understand," Blake said. "This isn't about changing terms. It's personal." I considered briefly, then nodded. "Go ahead." Blake took a breath, visibly composing himself. "Elodie, I want to acknowledge that my actions, particularly serving divorce papers while you were hospitalized, were inexcusable. There's no justification for that timing or approach." The admission hung in the air, surprising in its directness. I waited, sensing there was more. I also recognized that my financial disclosures were incomplete, he continued, choosing his words carefully with a glance toward Connor. "The court proceedings have made that clear." This carefully worded partial admission was classic Blake, acknowledging only what had been irrefutably proven while attempting to maintain some semblance of dignity. "Is there a question in there somewhere?" I asked, my tone neutral but firm. Blake seemed momentarily thrown by my response, perhaps expecting gratitude for his limited confession. "I suppose I'm asking if, beyond the legal settlement, there's a path to, if not reconciliation, then at least a less adversarial conclusion to our marriage." The request was so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. After weeks of deception, financial manipulation, and callous disregard, Blake was essentially asking for emotional absolution, a way to rewrite our ending that would preserve his self-image as a reasonable, decent man. "Blake," I said, meeting his gaze directly, "our marriage ended the moment you decided to serve me divorce papers while I was recovering from emergency surgery. Not because of the divorce itself, but because that action revealed who you truly are." He flinched slightly, but I continued with calm precision. "I don't harbor anger or resentment toward you anymore. Those emotions require investment, and I'm no longer investing in our relationship in any form. What I want is a clean, fair, legal resolution that allows us both to move forward separately." My response was not what he had expected, not emotional. Recrimination but clear-eyed assessment. For perhaps the first time, Blake was seeing me as I truly was, rather than as the projection he had created to fit his narrative. "I see," he said finally, something like genuine realization crossing his features. "Then let's proceed with the settlement." The remainder of the negotiation proceeded efficiently, with most remaining points resolved through straightforward compromise. By early afternoon, we had a framework agreement that Dominique and Connor would formalize into legal documents within the week. As the meeting concluded, Blake attempted one final moment of personal connection, extending his hand as we prepared to leave. "Good luck, Elodie," he said, his tone suggesting magnanimity despite his comprehensive defeat. "I hope you find what you're looking for." I accepted the handshake briefly, recognizing it as the performative gesture it was. "I already have, Blake. Peace of mind and clarity, something no settlement could provide." Outside the building, standing in the crisp autumn sunshine, I felt a profound sense of completion. The confrontation hadn't been the dramatic showdown that perhaps Blake had feared, or that Hollywood might have scripted. There had been no shouting, no accusations, no emotional breakdown. Instead, it had been something far more powerful. A clear-eyed recognition of reality, a methodical dismantling of deception, and ultimately, a reclaiming of narrative control. "How do you feel?" Dominique asked as we walked toward her car. I considered the question carefully. "Resolved," I said finally. "Not victorious or vindicated, just resolved." She nodded, understanding. "That's the healthiest outcome possible. Victory implies continuing emotional investment. Resolution means freedom to move forward." As we drove away, I glanced back at the towering office building where my marriage had effectively ended. Blake would return to his increasingly complicated life, his professional reputation potentially damaged, his relationship with Carissa likely strained by her cooperation with me, his financial maneuvers now under scrutiny from multiple directions. I, meanwhile, was driving toward something rather than away from it. A future undefined by betrayal. Or response to betrayal. A life reclaimed through strategic clarity rather than emotional reaction. The confrontation hadn't been about defeating Blake, though that had effectively happened. It had been about confronting truth itself, the truth of who he was, who I was, and what our marriage had actually been beneath the carefully maintained surface. And in that confrontation with reality, I had found something far more valuable than any settlement could provide. The unshakable knowledge that I was more than capable of standing on my own, not despite challenges, but because of how I faced them. The final divorce decree arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by courier, to Lorna's apartment where I was still staying while finalizing the purchase of my new home. The manila envelope felt surprisingly light, given the weight of what it contained. The official end of 7 years of marriage, distilled into legal language and a judge's signature. I opened it alone on Lorna's garden patio, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the flagstones. The terms matched exactly what we had negotiated. Full ownership of our primary residence transferred to me, the substantial financial settlement reflecting both documented and previously hidden assets, complete retraction of all claims against my business, and the non-disparagement clause protecting my professional standing. What struck me most, however, was the clinical nature of the document. Our complex history, the early years of genuine connection, the gradual distancing, the ultimate betrayal, had been reduced to assets and liabilities, property transfers, and financial obligations. The emotional reality of a marriage's end couldn't be captured in legal terminology. I called Dominique to confirm receipt of the documents, our conversation brief and practical. After weeks of intense strategy and negotiation, our professional relationship was concluding with the same efficiency that had characterized it throughout. The judge was particularly thorough in reviewing the financial disclosures, Dominique noted. She included specific language acknowledging the initially incomplete reporting from Blake's side. That's unusual and speaks to how seriously she took the discrepancies. "Will there be any professional consequences for him?" I asked, curious rather than vindictive. "That remains to be seen," Dominique replied. "The court has forwarded documentation to the State Bar Association regarding potential ethical concerns in his financial representations. Whether that results in any action is beyond our purview." After our call, I sat with the decree for a long time, allowing the finality to settle over me. This wasn't just the end of my marriage to Blake. It was the conclusion of a chapter in my life that had spanned my late 20s and early 30s. Formative years that had shaped my professional identity and worldview in ways I was only beginning to fully understand. Later that evening, I received a text from Perry Connor, Blake's college friend who had provided crucial information about the financial manipulation. I heard the divorce was finalized today. Blake's been placed on administrative leave at the firm pending review of his accounting practices. Thought you should know. I thanked him for the update without further comment. Blake's professional reckoning wasn't my concern, though it did represent a form of justice beyond what our legal system had delivered. Actions had consequences, a principle Blake had seemingly believed himself exempt from until now. The following day brought another form of closure. Carissa Powell requested a brief meeting at a quiet cafe downtown, arriving with the composed professionalism I had observed during our first encounter. "I won't take much of your time," she said, after declining anything but water. "I just wanted you to know that I've accepted a position with a firm in Chicago. I'll be leaving next week." "I appreciate you telling me in person," I replied, genuinely, "though I'm not sure why you felt it necessary." She considered this, tapping one manicured finger against her water glass. "I suppose because in some strange way, our lives became intertwined through Blake's deceptions. You deserve to hear directly that I'm removing myself completely from the situation." There was a symmetry to our interaction. Two professional women acknowledging each other's dignity despite circumstances that could have fostered animosity. "Blake misrepresented both of us to each other," I observed. "That was his choice, not ours." "Exactly." She offered a small smile. "For what it's worth, I've learned a valuable lesson about due diligence extending beyond financial matters." She prepared to leave, Carissa hesitated. "He's not doing well, you know. Professionally or personally. The firm's investigation is comprehensive." It wasn't said with any expectation of sympathy or response. Simply information shared between two people with a peculiar shared experience. "I wish you success in Chicago," I said, meaning it. The justice delivered through our divorce proceedings wasn't merely financial or legal. It was a recalibration of truth after months of distortion. Blake had initiated our divorce believing he controlled all variables: the timing, the narrative, the financial outcomes. His fundamental miscalculation had been underestimating both my resilience and the consequences of his own deceptions. The following weekend, I began the process of reclaiming our, now my, home. The modern glass house had never felt particularly warm or personal, designed more for impression than comfort. Blake had been staying in a downtown hotel since the asset freeze, meaning the house stood empty, preserved in its pristine, unlived-in state. Walking through the silent rooms, I saw everything differently. What had once seemed elegant now felt sterile. What had appeared sophisticated now seemed performative. This house had been chosen and designed to reflect Blake's vision of success, a showpiece rather than a home. "So what are you going to do with it?" Lorna asked as she helped me sort through closets, separating items for donation, storage, or continued use. "Sell it and start fresh?" "Actually, no," I replied, surprising myself with the certainty I felt. "I'm going to transform it. This house represents the largest single asset I received in the settlement. Selling it would be the expected move, but I'm tired of making expected moves." Instead, I had already engaged an architect to reimagine the space, softening the harsh angles, introducing warmth through natural materials, creating a sanctuary, aligned with my authentic preferences rather than Blake's cultivated image. "It's symbolic," I explained to Lorna's questioning look. "Taking something that represented one chapter of my life and transforming it rather than abandoning it. Finding value and potential in something that once represented pain. The justice I sought wasn't Blake's downfall, though that appeared to be unfolding through natural consequences, but rather my own reclamation and reinvention. The settlement had provided financial security and vindication of my business ownership, but the true justice was in the freedom to define my future on my own terms. This perspective crystallized during an unexpected encounter at a charity event. The following month, I had debated attending, knowing many from our former social circle would be present, but ultimately decided that absence would suggest discomfort or shame, where I felt neither. I arrived alone, dressed in a deep emerald gown that represented my first departure from the neutral palette Blake had always preferred. The subtle murmurs and glances as I entered confirmed that news of our divorce, and likely some version of the circumstances, had circulated widely. Rebecca Winters, Blake's first wife, approached as I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. "You look magnificent," she said, her genuine warmth a contrast to the calculated appraisals from others in the room. "Freedom suits you." "It does," I agreed, though I'm still discovering exactly what that means. Rebecca smiled, understanding implicit in her expression. "The best part comes after the dust settles. When you realize that your story didn't end with the divorce, it actually began there." As the evening progressed, I navigated conversations with diplomatic precision, neither avoiding mentions of the divorce nor dwelling on them. When asked directly about Blake's absence, I simply responded that we had finalized our divorce amicably and were both moving forward with our separate lives. This measured approach seemed to disappoint those hungry for drama while reassuring others concerned about social awkwardness. By the event's end, I had effectively established my continued presence in these circles as an independent entity rather than half of a former couple. The true measure of justice wasn't in Blake's professional difficulties or social embarrassment, but in the simple fact that I was standing confidently on my own, not as a victim seeking sympathy, nor as a victor claiming spoils, but as a woman who had faced betrayal with dignity and emerged stronger for the experience. As Rebecca had suggested, my story hadn't ended with divorce papers served in a hospital room. That had simply been the catalyst for a new beginning, one where justice wasn't delivered through courts alone, but through the reclamation of my authentic self. 2 months after the divorce was finalized, I stood in the newly renovated kitchen of my home, admiring the transformation. Where once there had been cold marble and sterile steel, Blake's idea of sophistication, warm wood and natural stone now created an inviting space that actually encouraged cooking rather than just displaying expensive appliances. The renovation had become a metaphor for my own rebuilding, stripping away what didn't serve me while preserving the structural elements worth keeping. The house that had once been a showcase for Blake's success was now becoming a genuine reflection of my preferences and priorities. My phone chimed with an incoming call from Carrie. "Are you seeing this?" she asked without preamble when I answered. "Seeing what?" "Check your email, specifically the Business Journal subscription." I opened my laptop, finding the latest digital edition of the Regional Business Journal with the headline, "Winters Investment Group under federal investigation for financial irregularities." The article detailed an expanding investigation into Blake's firm, triggered initially by internal auditing concerns, but now involving federal regulatory authorities. Blake's name appeared prominently, described as currently on administrative leave pending investigation outcomes. "This isn't our concern," I reminded Carrie, closing the laptop. "Blake's professional issues are separate from our business." "I know," she agreed. "It's just validating, I guess. Seeing real consequences for his actions beyond the divorce settlement." I understood her perspective. There was a natural human satisfaction in seeing justice extend beyond our private resolution into public accountability. But I had already moved beyond needing that validation. "How's the Thompson proposal coming?" I asked, deliberately changing the subject to our largest potential new client. The shift wasn't about avoiding Blake as a topic, it was about prioritizing my present and future over connections to the past. The most honorable victory wasn't watching Blake face consequences. It was demonstrating through my choices and focus that he no longer occupied significant space in my thinking. Later that week, I met with Dr. Perry for my final post-surgical checkup. My physical recovery had progressed remarkably well, with only the faintest scar remaining as evidence of the emergency procedure that had coincided with Blake's divorce filing. "You've healed beautifully," Dr. Perry confirmed after the examination. "Both physically and, if I may say, emotionally. Many patients in similar circumstances struggle with the compound stress of health crises and personal upheaval. The two were connected in unexpected ways, I acknowledged. Blake's betrayal during my medical crisis clarified things that might have remained murky under normal circumstances. Dr. Perry nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes our most profound healing comes through challenges that force us to recognize our own strength. That evening, I hosted a small dinner party, my first since the divorce. Lorna was there, along with Carrie, and Miranda, Rebecca Winters, and two other friends who had provided support during the difficult months. The gathering wasn't a divorce celebration as Lorna had initially suggested, but rather an acknowledgement of transition and gratitude for the relationships that had sustained me. As we enjoyed dinner in the newly renovated dining room, the conversation flowed naturally from business developments to personal updates without awkward avoidance of the divorce topic. When it did arise, it was addressed matter-of-factly, without the emotional charge that had surrounded it weeks earlier. "I ran into Connor Mills yesterday," Rebecca mentioned as we moved to the living room with dessert. "He's no longer representing Blake, apparently. Cited irreconcilable professional differences." "Not surprising," I replied. "Connor's reputation is too valuable to risk on Blake's increasingly complicated situation. Have you had any direct contact with Blake recently?" Carrie asked, the question posed without judgment. "One text message last week," I acknowledged. "He wanted to discuss mutual public statements regarding the federal investigation. I directed him to Dominique, who advised that our non-disparagement clause doesn't obligate me to coordinate messaging about matters arising after our divorce." The calm practicality with which I could now discuss Blake struck me as perhaps the most significant measure of my healing. He had been reduced to his proper proportion in my life, a closed chapter rather than an ongoing influence. The honorable victory wasn't in Blake's downfall, but in my refusal to derive satisfaction from it. I had insisted on equitable treatment and transparent financial disclosure during our divorce, but I took no pleasure in watching his professional reputation unravel beyond what directly affected me. This perspective was tested the following week when Stan Geller, Blake's friend and our former family attorney, requested a meeting. Curious about his purpose, I agreed to a brief coffee at a neutral location. Stan looked uncomfortable as we settled at a quiet corner table, his usual confident demeanor subdued. "Thank you for meeting me, Elodie. I'll be direct. Blake is facing serious professional and potentially legal challenges. He's asked me to approach you about possibly modifying certain terms of your non-disclosure agreement." "For what purpose?" I asked, more curious than defensive. "He believes that a statement from you confirming his general financial trustworthiness in your personal dealings could help counterbalance some of the current scrutiny." The request was breathtaking in its audacity. Blake wanted me to publicly vouch for the very financial integrity he had systematically violated throughout our divorce. "Stan," I said after a measured pause, "I appreciate your position as the messenger here, but surely you understand how inappropriate this request is. Blake's current difficulties stem from his own choices, not from our divorce agreement." Stan sighed, nodding reluctantly. I told him it was a long shot. For what it's worth, I think he genuinely doesn't understand the magnitude of what he did. Not just legally, but personally. That's been Blake's fundamental limitation, I observed without rancor. He's always viewed relationships as transactions, with terms that can be renegotiated when circumstances change. The conversation ended amicably but firmly, with no concessions offered or expected. As I watched Stan leave, I realized that this interaction represented another form of victory, the ability to engage with Blake's issues dispassionately, without being drawn back into his manipulative patterns. The honorable victory continued to manifest in unexpected ways. When the local Women's Business Alliance asked me to speak at their annual conference about resilience and professional reinvention, I accepted with one condition. My presentation would focus on strategic thinking and adaptive leadership without referencing my divorce specifically. "But your story is so powerful," the organizer protested. The way you handled such a difficult personal situation while running a successful business, that's exactly what our members need to hear. The principles and strategies are what matter, I explained. Using my personal situation as the framework would center my identity around my divorce rather than my professional expertise. That's exactly what I'm choosing not to do. The presentation was ultimately one of the most successful of the conference, precisely because it focused on widely applicable strategies rather than personal drama. Several attendees approached afterward to thank me for addressing resilience in professional terms, while acknowledging that personal challenges often require similar strategic thinking. This approach, refusing to build a narrative identity around victimhood or vindication, represented the most honorable aspect of my victory. Blake had attempted to define me through his actions. First as the wife whose value was in supporting his image, then as the inconvenient obstacle to be removed during illness, and finally as the adversary to be outmaneuvered in divorce. By declining each of these defined roles and instead authoring my own story, I had achieved a victory more meaningful than any court decision or financial settlement. I had reclaimed not just assets and legal rights, but the fundamental authority to determine who I was and who I would become. The most honorable victory, in the end, wasn't defined by what happened to Blake, but by what happened within me. The discovery that betrayal had not diminished, but rather revealed my capacity for strategic clarity, emotional resilience, and authentic self-definition. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected email from Blake. The subject line was simple: request for meeting. The timing was curious, coming just 2 weeks after federal charges had been filed against several members of his investment firm, though Blake himself had apparently avoided criminal indictment through cooperation with investigators. I considered ignoring the message entirely. There was no legal or practical reason to engage further with Blake, and our non-disparagement agreement didn't require personal contact. Yet something, perhaps simple curiosity or a desire for complete closure, led me to read the brief message. Elodie, I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I would appreciate the opportunity to speak with you in person. This isn't about legal matters or requesting anything. I simply need to say some things that should have been said long ago. If you're willing, please suggest a time and public place of your choosing. After consulting with Dominique, who confirmed no legal concerns with such a meeting provided I maintained appropriate boundaries, I agreed to a brief conversation at a cafe near my office, a location that was both public and would naturally limit the duration of our interaction. Blake arrived punctually, looking markedly different than when I'd last seen him. The polished confidence had given way to a more subdued demeanor. He'd lost weight, and fine lines had deepened around his eyes and mouth. He wore a simple button-down shirt rather than his customary designer suit. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he began after ordering only black coffee. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," I replied honestly. "What did you want to discuss?" Blake seemed to gather his thoughts, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if drawing warmth from it. "I've had a lot of time for reflection. Recently. Mandatory reflection, you might say." A rueful smile flickered briefly. "The federal investigation, the professional censure, the social fallout, it's been illuminating." I waited, neither encouraging nor discouraging his continued speech. "I didn't understand what I was doing when I served you those divorce papers in the hospital," he continued. "Or rather, I understood the tactical advantage but not the human reality. I've been thinking about that moment, what it revealed about the person I had become. This wasn't what I had expected. Blake had always excelled at strategic apologies designed to achieve specific outcomes. This felt different, less calculated, more genuine in its uncertainty. The thing is, Elodie, you were right in that settlement meeting. The way I handled our divorce revealed who I truly was. Not just to you, but eventually to myself. He looked up, meeting my gaze directly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and you don't need to give it. I just wanted you to know that I recognize the harm I caused, not just legally or financially, but fundamentally as one human being to another. The acknowledgement hung between us, unexpected and unsolicited. It wasn't offered as a bargaining chip or to elicit sympathy, but simply as a truth he needed to express. What will you do now? I asked, neither accepting nor rejecting his acknowledgement. Start over, he said simply. I've lost the partnership, most of my assets, and any professional credibility. I'm relocating to Arizona next month to work with my cousin's small financial advisory firm, assuming the regulatory bodies allow me to remain in the field at all. As our brief meeting concluded, Blake made no attempt to extend it or to establish any ongoing connection. He simply thanked me again for meeting him and wished me well. Walking back to my office afterward, I felt a curious sense of lightness. Blake's acknowledgement hadn't changed the past or erased the harm he had caused, but it had removed a subtle weight I hadn't fully recognized. The burden of wondering if he had ever truly understood the magnitude of his actions. The redemptive moment wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was simply the closing of a circuit, the completion of understanding that allowed both of us to move forward with clear eyes about what had happened between us. In the end, this unexpected epilogue reinforced what I had already discovered through the divorce process. True resolution comes not from external validation or even justice, but from the internal clarity that allows us to integrate difficult experiences into our life narrative without being defined by them. A year to the day after receiving divorce papers in my hospital bed, I stood on the balcony of my transformed home, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The anniversary had not escaped my notice, though its emotional impact had diminished to a gentle acknowledgement rather than a sharp reminder. The year had brought changes both external and internal. My business had expanded, adding 2 new partners and a dedicated office in the financial district. The renovation of my home was complete, the space now reflecting my authentic preferences rather than Blake's calculated aesthetics. Most significantly, I had developed a new understanding of myself, my capabilities, boundaries, and priorities. Lorna joined me on the balcony, handing me a glass of champagne. To 1 year of freedom, she toasted, raising her glass. To transformation, I countered, gently amending her characterization. Because that was the most profound result of the past year. Not simply freedom from an unhealthy marriage, but transformation through the process of reclaiming my life. The divorce had been the catalyst, not the conclusion. Later that evening, as I sorted through some old files in preparation for a home office renovation, I came across the hospital bracelet from my admission a year earlier. Such a small, mundane object to mark such a pivotal moment. I had been wheeled into emergency surgery believing one reality about my life and marriage, only to awaken to a fundamentally different truth. I placed the bracelet in a small keepsake box rather than discarding it. Not as a reminder of betrayal, but as acknowledgement of a crucial turning point, the moment when crisis had revealed both Blake's true character and my own resilience. The following week, I met with Dominique for lunch, our first purely social engagement after months of professional interaction. Our conversation naturally turned to reflection on the case that had brought us together. You were an unusual client, she observed. Most people facing similar circumstances are driven primarily by emotional reactions, understandably so. Your strategic approach was remarkable. It wasn't absence of emotion, I clarified. It was refusing to let emotion dictate strategy. There's a difference. Dominique nodded. That distinction is what allowed you to achieve such a comprehensive resolution. You never lost sight of the larger objectives even in the most difficult moments. This observation crystallized something I had been contemplating throughout my recovery and rebuilding. The experience hadn't made me harder or more cynical, as might have been expected. Instead, it had clarified my understanding of how emotion and strategy could work in tandem rather than opposition. I had emerged from the experience with greater trust in my judgment, clearer boundaries in relationships, and a deeper appreciation for authentic connections over superficial appearances. The betrayal that might have diminished me had instead revealed capabilities I hadn't fully recognized in myself. The transformative reflection wasn't a single moment of revelation, but a gradual integration of experience into wisdom. Blake's betrayal during my most vulnerable moment hadn't destroyed my capacity for trust. It had refined it, teaching me to distinguish between genuine connection and strategic manipulation. As I moved forward into the second year of my reconstructed life, I carried not the weight of victimhood, but the strength of transformation. The hospital bracelet, the divorce decree, the renovated home, all were now simply chapters in a continuing story defined not by what had been lost, but by what had been discovered in the aftermath. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.